DAR Museum presents Drafting a Late 19th Century Bodice using the MacDowell Garment Drafting Machine. This is the pattern drafting system from the private collection of Alden O'Brien, Curator of Fashion and Textiles at the DAR Museum. The system has 5 parts: the back, side body, underarm, and front, as well as a sleeve which is not pictured. It also has a diagram and used to come with an instruction booklet. This is the diagram we will be following. It instructs the user to set the back first, followed by the side body, then the underarm, then the front piece, using the measurements of the person who the bodice is intended for. Step 1. Measuring. The measurements needed to draft this bodice include the circumference of the neck, bust, waist, and hips, the center front length from neck to waist and neck to hips, the center back length from neck to waist and neck to hips, the circumference of the arm's eye, the underarm length to waist and to hips, and the shoulder width at the front and the back. Step 2. Setting the machine. Using our measurements, we set the machine. Following the instructions, we begin with the back piece. First, the arm's eye is set, followed by the width of the back, and then the lower and upper lengths at center back. Next, the neck is set, then the shoulder length, then the waist, and then the hip. The curve of the seam that connects with the side piece is automatically adjusted to the right size by the manipulation of the other pieces. For the side piece, the first thing it is set is the curve of the seam that connects to the back, using the value from the back piece. Next, the arm's eye is set, followed by the underarm length, then the waist, then the hip. Moving on to the underarm piece, the underarm length is set first. Next is the bust, followed by the waist, and ending with the hip. The front piece is the most complex to set as it has the most moving parts. Begin with the underarm length, then move on to setting the lower and upper center front lengths. Then set the neck, followed by the shoulder length, and then the arm's eye. Next, set the bust, and then adjust the top points of both darts. Adjust the bottom points of the darts, and then finish by setting the hips. Now our machine is set and ready to move on to the next step. Step 3. Drafting the pattern. Begin by arranging the pattern machine on your fabric or pattern paper. The instructions describe how to mark your pattern. Trace along the outside of the frames for the cutting lines, and trace along the inside of the frame for your sewing lines. This gives you approximately 1 centimeter of seam allowance. Additionally, you want to trace along the bottom of the waist and along the inside of the darts. Next, cut out your pattern pieces along the traced outer lines of the frame. Admittedly, we missed the seam allowance note, so we cut out our pieces with about an inch seam allowance outside the frames. Step 4. Pinning the mock-up. Pin or sew together your pattern pieces along the traced inner frame sewing lines. Keeping the pattern pieces in order as you cut them out helped us join each of the seams properly. We realized afterwards that it was better to pin from the top down instead of the bottom up, and redid our pinning before we tried it on. Because of our seam allowance error, we pinned along the original cutting lines, and we ended up with excess material when we tried it on. Finally, our mock-up is ready to try on. Step 5. Trying on the mock-up. We decided that it would be easier to try the mock-up on before pinning the shoulders together and would also reduce my risk of being pricked. So first, we put the bodice on, then we pinned the shoulders into place. Then, we folded the front raw edges of the seam allowance back and pinned them where they would meet in the center front for a front closing bodice. At this point, we realized we had excess material from adding seam allowance, so we pinned the mock-up along the seams so that it would fit better. And here is the finished mock-up, so that all of the seams are visible. Trying this method proved how easy it was to make a custom bodice. This is especially helpful for someone who has a shorter or longer torso than the provided standard measurements. Thanks for joining us!